The Soul Reaver, Kain's ancient blade, older than any of us and 1,000 times more deadly. The legends claimed that the blade was possessed and thrived by devouring the souls of its victims. For all our bravado, we knew what it meant when Kain drew the Soul Reaver in anger. It meant you were dead.
As a weapon which has appeared in every title in the Legacy of Kain series, the Reaver's importance to the overarching story cannot be overstated. The blade's long history connects it to many power struggles and gambits throughout Nosgoth's treacherous and bloody past. From power-hungry warlords to devious sorcerers to vengeful Rayphs, the Reaver has fallen into the hands of those who would use its incredible destructive force to achieve their own ends. A complete history of the Reaver is difficult to provide because of the numerous loops it goes through in the timeline, not to mention the gaps in its chronology. While we cannot irrefutably say what became of the blade at certain points in its history, I will nevertheless endeavour to provide an overview of its story, from its creation to its ultimate dispersal. So prepare yourself for a bumpy ride, as we travel across multiple timelines and dive into the intricate lore that is Soul Reaver. Thousands of years ago in Nosgoth's early past, the Reaver was forged by the swordsmith Vorador at the behest of the ancient vampires, in order to defeat their prophesied adversary, the Hilden Champion. Vorador's sire, Janos Audron, along with the other Pillar Guardians, enchanted the blade with sorcery, granting it unique abilities. The most prominent of these abilities was the power to drain its victims of their precious lifeblood, making it a formidable weapon to stand against. At the time of the forging of the Nine Pillars, and the banishment of their Hilden adversaries to the demon realm, Janos was called upon as the 10th Guardian, charged with safekeeping the Reaver until the vampire champion Raziel came to claim it. Eventually the Rayph Raziel would arrive at Janos' retreat, but later than expected during the height of the Seraphim's vampire purge. Janos attempts to give the blade to Raziel, but he rejects it, feeling at once horribly repelled by the sword for some unknown reason to him. At this very moment, the Seraphim forces attack, breaching Janos' chambers after following the path naively paved open by Raziel. The Seraphim storm the retreat, murdering Janos and taking the Reaver with them. A dying Janos conveys to Raziel his importance and advises him to reclaim the blade, as it was forged for him and him alone. Blinded by rage and driven to fulfill his destiny, Raziel pursues the Seraphim commanders all the way to their stronghold, but before he can confront the Seraphim, he discovers the Reaver suspiciously laid across his path. Alone now with the blade, Raziel feels the same inexplicable dread he felt when Janos first presented it to him, and yet he also feels overwhelmingly compelled to seize the sword. Before he can, however, he is interrupted by the Time Guardian Moebius, who takes a few moments to mock and taunt Raziel for playing right into his hands. It's important to note here how Moebius cunningly uses his staff to disable Raziel's Rayph blade, thereby encouraging Raziel to pick up the Reaver blade and use it as his weapon.
Using his staff to disable my Rayph blade, Moebius effectively disarmed me, leaving me with only one choice of weapon. And yet I confess, it was not the lack of options, but blind rage that made me take up the Reaver. In my fury, it felt as though my hand had acted of its own will. And now, that same hand clutched the hilt with unyielding strength, and I felt a constrained tingling, a remote but palpable sense of longing, as the disabled Rayph blade tried vainly to embrace its physical twin.
What I find interesting here is that immediately following this cutscene, Raziel cannot put the Reaver down. Whilst during gameplay, if you try to throw or drop the blade, the game will literally prevent you, as if the sword is exerting some mysterious power over Raziel. Believe me, even trying to toggle into the spectral realm in an effort to force Raziel to release the sword is not allowed. From here on out, to the end of the game, Raziel and the Reaver are inseparable. Fighting his way through the stronghold, Raziel is confronted by his former brethren, Malchiah, Zephon, Rahab, Duma, and Turel, who despite launching fierce attacks on the Rayph, cannot inflict any lasting damage on him. It is said that the sword, which is shaped in the form of a serpent's tongue, is indestructible, as it was forged with the same metal and energy as the pillars of Nosgoth. Somehow, in these crucial moments, its indestructibility passes over to Raziel, its powers making him immune to any physical assault.
As Malchiah and Zephon fell before my blade, I felt the Reaver's bloodthirst as keenly as I ever had when I was still a vampire. I could sense the boundary between us dissolving. The Reaver was consumed with my rage, and I was intoxicated by its bloodlust. The blade had a vitalizing effect on me. My physical energy no longer decayed over time, and the wounds inflicted by my foes healed almost instantly. The Reaver had made me invincible.
After slaughtering his brethren, Raziel arrives at the chapter house, only to find his Sarafan self waiting for him there. Raziel quickly dispatches him as well, ironically mentioning how his history has come full circle. Here we come to one of the most crucial and soul-crushing scenes in the series. Sensing its physical twin, the Rayph blade manifests and coils itself around the sword before the conjoined blades turn on Raziel, impaling him. And in this defining moment, Raziel realizes the Reaver was never forged to be a soul-stealing weapon. The soul-devouring entity trapped in the blade was, and always had been, Raziel, driven insane by thousands of years of imprisonment. It is at this point where the blade transforms from being a sword that merely drained the blood of its victims to the Soul Reaver, capable of consuming souls. Well, this would have been the moment if not for Kain's intervention, which by the minutest of chances creates a new timeline. But let's wind the clock back a bit. What you need to know about Legacy of Kain is that this is a story that adheres to strict rules of time travel. The time travel model follows Novikov's self-consistency principle, which can be summed up like this: you cannot go back in time and change history, because you didn't. Legacy of Kain flips this on its head and essentially says, if you do go back, then you did go back, which means that the timeline is essentially fixed, and anything the protagonist does in the past was already part of that established course of events. This is eloquently explained by the title character himself.
You must understand, our presence here doesn't alter history. You and I meet here because we are compelled to. We have always met here. History is irredeemable. Drop a stone into a rushing river. The current simply courses around it and flows on as if the obstruction were never there. You and I are pebbles, Raziel, and have even less hope of disrupting the time stream. The continuum of history is simply too strong, too resilient.
Rather than having a history that is fragile and easily altered, reality is actively being conserved. Time is essentially immutable, apart from one exception to the rule, a loophole involving the Soul Reaver. In fact, this exception has been exploited at least 3 times across the games. As such, 4 known timelines exist in the series, 3 of which have sprouted off one after another, altering fate. Going back to when the Reaver impales Raziel, everything that happens chronologically up to this moment can be referred to as Timeline 1. Let's ignore Kain's interference for now. In the first timeline, he actually never shows up to pull the sword out from Raziel's body. Therefore, all that's left for Rayph Raziel is to dissolve into dust, while his soul is swallowed up by the blade. The first timeline will continue as normal, presumably with Moebius coming to collect the blade, and retaining possession of it for the next 450 years, until the birth of the beloved boy king, William the Just. Moebius would eventually journey to William's kingdom, seeking an audience with the king, while addressing and rallying crowds of villagers with hateful speeches against Nosgoth's vampire population. These were apparently rousing enough to grant Moebius his audience. It is at this point when Moebius gifts the Soul Reaver to William that he warns him of a vampire menace who would seek to take his life. Sometime around then, a future version of Kain attempts to assassinate William, but fails, which allows history of the first timeline to proceed as normal, with William placing more of his trust in Moebius, who he employs as his advisor. Over the ensuing 40 years, the time streamer will continue to poison William's mind, gradually transforming him from a kind and righteous monarch into a sadistic tyrant known as the Nemesis, who conquers and ravages Nosgoth with his fanatically loyal and ruthless army. While the legions of the Nemesis march from the north to decimate all in their path, a young but ambitious vampire conveniently discovers a future incarnation of the Soul Reaver on his journey through Avernus Cathedral.
Time fades even legend, and the origin of Soul Reaver has been lost long ago. But its purpose remains, to feed on the souls of any creature it strikes. Kindred, this blade and I.
Taking the fabled soul-devouring weapon as his prize, the fledgling Kain continues on his quest to cleanse the Circle of Nine, but soon finds himself embroiled in a human conflict between the legions of the Nemesis to the north and Willendorf's army of the Last Hope. Willendorf's army is completely outmatched by the Nemesis' horde, forcing Kain to flee nearly 50 years into the past. Kain realizes that if he kills William here at this early stage of his life, the Nemesis and his unstoppable legions would never come to exist. So Kain does what he thinks is logical and attacks William, who just so happens to be in possession of a younger version of the Soul Reaver that was gifted to him by Moebius. The clash between the two seemingly indestructible swords breaks William's Reaver and triggers the first paradox, killing William and reshaping history, creating the second timeline. This power to alter time is a quality unique to the Soul Reaver that goes far beyond its original design. The gist of it is that since the Reaver acts as a vessel for Raziel's spirit, it can dislodge history, creating paradoxes and new timelines when brought into proximity with Raziel or another version of itself.
Moebius propelled William and me together, but ensured first that we were both armed with the Soul Reaver. The Reaver is the key. Two incarnations of the blade meet in time and space. A paradox is created, a temporal distortion powerful enough to derail history.
The second timeline is similar to the first except for one notable distinction. The Nemesis and his armies are removed from the equation, leaving a fanatical mercenary cult in their place, bent on exterminating all vampires in the name of their martyred king, which was exactly what Moebius was aiming for. William's broken Reaver, now recovered by Moebius, is brought to the Sarafan stronghold. It is held here within a chapel, dedicated to the fallen king, with the two pieces of the sword placed on the sarcophagus. A version of Raziel from the distant future, before having his soul imprisoned in the sword, discovers William's chapel. Armed with an older Reaver, his own twin soul, the Rayph blade, Raziel unintentionally activates another Reaver convergence. Although this one does not ignite any fatal paradoxes, he does find his soul being leached to restore the blade. I particularly enjoy how terrified Moebius is in this scene. Raziel may not comprehend the significance of the two Reavers coming together, but Moebius sure does. That's why he's trembling. Normally history would not allow Moebius to die here, because he is fated to die at Kain's hands. For the most part, Moebius is assured in his belief that something will always happen to preserve his life, until his preordained death. But here, with the Reavers together like this, history is close to a paradox. If Raziel strikes him down right now in this very instant, his plans will completely unravel, and history would be forced to change.
These blades, now coiled in sinister embrace, have inspired terror in the hearts of creatures far more durable than you, old man. Bound together as they are, I can only imagine what they could do to your soul's fragile shell.
Raziel, I beg you to stay your hand. This was none of my doing. I have sought only to aid you in your righteous quest.
Why, you're trembling, Moebius. Has your confidence abandoned you? You seem to have made a fatal error by leaving your precious staff behind. Is that where all your courage comes from?
Moebius is of course able to talk and manipulate his way out of this. And lucky for him, because if Raziel did decide to go through with killing him, it'd be game over for the Time Streamer. I don't even think the Elder God would have been able to bring Moebius back from a paradox like that. Raziel would later visit William's chapel again, only this time to be confronted by an older Kain. Discussing the true nature of Nosgoth's history, Kain explains to Raziel how time is fixed, and cannot be altered except for a loophole which can be exploited by burning two Soul Reavers together. As he says this, Kain approaches Raziel with the Reaver from William's altar, causing the Rayph blade to manifest from Raziel's arm. Kain then surprises Raziel by offering the physical blade to him by the hilt. Thinking he's gained an edge over Kain, Raziel quickly presses his advantage, threatening the Vampire King, only for the conjoined blades to begin acting of their own volition. They tug at Raziel and pull at him in an effort to compel him to end Kain's life. Kain concedes that this is the moment where he is destined to die, and that Raziel is the only one among them all with free will. He alone has the power to change fate. Consequently, this scene can play out one of two ways. Either Raziel kills Kain and continues on his quest for knowledge, travelling through different time periods until he is consumed by the original Reaver, or Kain persuades the Rayph into not killing him, with Raziel barely diverting the blade and instead driving it into William's sarcophagus. If the latter of these two outcomes occurs, then the second paradox is set in motion, and history again is reshuffled to accommodate Raziel's decision. It is important to understand that while Raziel may have a degree of free will, he is not unwriting history, he is simply rewriting it. The future courses around the actions of our protagonists, finding the path of least resistance, while omitting only the slightest alterations. This can be seen in the reshuffling Raziel experiences when he refuses to kill Kain. Whether he elects to finish Kain off or not, Raziel abandons the physical blade, which we can assume is picked up yet again by Moebius and brought to Avernus Cathedral for a much younger Kain to eventually find, who would of course use it in his duel against William, setting Moebius' own cunning plans in motion. Now, after eliminating the remaining members of the Circle and clearing all obstacles from his path, this younger version of Kain fully embraces his vampirism and savours his victory by appointing himself as Nosgoth's new ruler. Stretching his empire out across the furthest corners of Nosgoth, Kain retains possession of the sword over the next millennia, with it becoming his signature weapon. He wields it during his Lieutenant Raziel's execution, and still holds the Reaver centuries later when Raziel returns as a Rayph. During their first encounter at the Pillars, Kain brings the blade down on Raziel, but this paradoxical meeting of two versions of the same soul causes it to shatter, freeing the Rayph blade within. Binding itself to Raziel, it becomes his symbiotic weapon.
The blade is vanquished. So it unfolds. And we are a step closer to our destinies.
I swore I saw a glint of satisfaction in Kain's eye when the Soul Reaver was destroyed. I did not understand the game that Kain was playing, but I knew the finishing move.
From this moment and ever afterward, you and this blade are inextricably bound. Soul Reaver and Reaver of Souls, your destinies are intertwined. By destroying the sword, you have liberated it from its corporeal prison and restored it to its true form, a Rayph blade, its energy unbound. No longer a physical blade, it can only manifest itself in the material realm when your strength is fully restored. Once manifest, it will sustain you.
Much like its physical counterpart, the Rayph blade was the most powerful weapon in the games, and could easily dispatch most enemies with a few hits, followed up with a finishing move. After dealing with his vampire brethren, Raziel takes the Rayph blade with him as he pursues Kain into the distant past. It seems incredible to me even now that this is actually the third time the Rayph blade gets to redo all these pivotal moments, which it first went through as Raziel, then as the physical blade, and finally as the unbound blade of energy attached to Raziel's arm. Everything that I mentioned before, including the restoration of William's Reaver, to the fatal confrontation with Kain, to Raziel's impalement, is a tragic chain of events that is destined to play out in this inexorable cycle for all eternity. By sparing Kain and triggering the second paradox, Raziel in turn postpones the devouring of his own soul, thanks to Kain actually being present this time around to tear the blade out from Raziel's chest. It's a crucial scene, but with dire consequences. The room warps around the pair as the future strains to reshuffle itself for a third time. However, given the look of horror slowly mounting on Kain's face, he realizes that by saving Raziel, he may have just paid a terrible price.
Behind Kain's eyes, I could see new memories blooming and dying as history labored to reshuffle itself around this monumental obstruction. And I could see by the dawning horror on his face that perhaps we had strained history too far this time. That by trying to alter my fate, he may have introduced a fatal paradox.
My God. The Hilden. We walked right into their trap.
This was the biggest divergence to the timeline, and was the one that ended up creating the most changes. By helping to bring the Hilden Lord back from the demon realm, providing him with a suitable vessel, and even altering history to the point where he ended up in possession of the Reaver in Blood Omen 2. But let's not dwell too much on Blood Omen 2. What's important is that the third paradox paved the way for Raziel to visit the Spirit Forge and purify the Reaver of all corruption before using it to heal Kain at the very end of Defiance. Ultimately, Raziel selflessly allows himself to be drawn into the blade, which creates the physical Soul Reaver, while also freeing his future spirit from an eternity of imprisonment. It's quite fitting in a way. Raziel has both imprisoned and freed himself in the same instant. And that is basically a complete chronological timeline of the Soul Reaver. There are of course other moments that involve the sword in the series, but the ones I mentioned I think are the most significant. In the end, one should think of the Reaver as a key which can redeem or damn Nosgoth, depending on how it's used. It can kill Kain, sundering the pillars to an eternity of collapse and decay, or purify him, allowing new guardians to be born. Notably, the physical Soul Reaver is the only weapon that exists capable of hurting the Elder God, making it an integral piece in Kain's ambition to rid the world of the parasitic Elder and restore the land. The last glimpse we see of the blade is with Kain holding it while pondering Raziel's sacrifice. It is not definitively known what happens to the blade after the climax of Defiance, but we can guess that Kain would leave it at the base of the pillars for a certain time streamer to find, thus allowing all these events to transpire again, starting with Moebius passing the Soul Reaver over to William. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoy Legacy of Kain and my content, do leave a like and consider subscribing for more in-depth lore videos. Have a great day, and I hope to see you all again.